Welcome back, I am the Executioner, and today we're going to be talking about Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hans Hermann Hoppe is a German-born Austrian economist and philosopher who's known for his ideas of covenant communities, physical removal, and argumentation ethics, including his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, which compares and contrasts monarchy to democracy. Now, his book in general goes over how monarchy generally has a lower time preference compared to democracies, which have a higher time preference. Democracies are focused on the here and now. They are more likely to spend a lot of money than a monarchy due to the fact that they do not bear the personal responsibility for their actions. They are a temporary caretaker of government, while a monarch holds his position, usually for life, and bears the consequences if he or she goes bankrupt. This is not to say that Hans Hermann Hoppe is a monarchist. Far from that. He even specifies that he's not. He's just comparing and contrasting a alternative view to history here. How the World War I basically created the modern republic as we see it. The American modern republic with Wilsonian democracy. And how that kind of breached out into the world and kind of causes a lot of the problems we see today. As opposed to monarchy, which was much more reserved. And how the powers at be in Europe prior to World War I were mainly focused on monarchies, Austria-Hungary, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and many others. But due to the fact that democracy was applied in these countries post-World War I, it's really about how the United States became the sole superpower after World War I, and how the American Republic model really spread across the world and led to Bolshevism and a whole bunch of problems we see today. The German Republic, for example, the Weimar Republic, due to it being a very open democracy, allowed for the Nazis to gain power. Also, with the provisional Russian government, which was a democracy, it allowed the Bolsheviks to gain power in the Soviet Union and the eventual expulsion of the Mensheviks, and a whole host of other things which is common to European democracy. This is how he presents his opinion, his theory, and he lays it out throughout 300 pages, and it's a very compelling read. I have the audiobook, and it's definitely an interesting take on a alternate position to history, which a lot of mainstream historians do not subscribe to, but he presents his case in such a way that you are hard-pressed not to agree with him. But Hans Hermann Hoppe, in his book Democracy, the God That Failed, presents a vision for a new libertarian order, one that's made up of a voluntary aristocracy. Now, this voluntary aristocracy would be people who have good moral character, present good leadership skills, and attract other people to them and build communities around voluntary associations. Now, this also leads into covenant communities, a way of having a community, a social contract, if you will, but not in the way that we know it. Now, this contract would be very much like a social contract with rules and other things, where in every society has to have rules. Whether they are codified, legislated, or not, we must have rules. So, in this covenant community, it is codified, but it is a voluntary agreement among property owners to abide by certain terms and conditions to live in a geographical area. The difference between a state is that this is voluntary versus a state which relies on force to expand and eventually form into countries. So in a covenant community, it can be basically anything. It could be a gay community, for example, an LGBT community that wants to live away from homophobia. Or it could be a homophobic community that wants to live away from gay people. It's about a voluntary association or freedom of association here. Does that make it ethically right? Well, it depends on what you think. It is ethically right in the context that people have freedom of association and are able to exclude anyone they see fit due to the fact that you are not required to serve someone. Think about that. If you were required to serve or let anyone onto your property, regardless of qualifications that you impose, that's tantamount to someone controlling what you can and cannot do with that. Now, is it emotionally of emotional sentiment to some people? Well, no. Some people would disagree of homophobic people not letting gay people eat at a certain restaurant, for example. But that's up to the business owner, for example, due to private property rights. But in the context of covenant communities, a gay community could kick out homophobes. They could prevent anyone who is homophobic from living in that community. And it's a system of private law. And that is a system where you need some type of enforcement. Now, it could be passive enforcement, but it could also be rights arbitration, if you will, a private way of doing law. Now, the difference between a state is it is definitely voluntary. If you don't want to live in that community, don't live in that community. It's similar to let's say, a homophobic person trying to live in a gay community, for example. Those people will not really like a homophobic individual. So what they can do is, if this person enters under false pretexts, saying that they are not homophobic, but they end up being a homophobic asshole, what they can do is a process called physical removal, where they distance themselves socially from that individual and refuse services to that individual, and eventually that individual will move out as a result. Physical removal has a negative connotation as Hans Hermann Hoppe put it originally, he imparts some of his own tastes onto the covenant community model. But the covenant community model can definitely work for what Hoppe describes as alternative lifestyles. So this is an open framework. If a homosexual community wants to exclude homophobic people or heterosexual people, they can do that, and vice versa. So what this is really about is private property rights, protecting your own tastes as well, coming together with like-minded individuals. And this can be, a covenant community can be anything. It could be Star Wars fans, it could be Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, for example. All it needs is a recognition of private property, a voluntary contract, and an ability to leave that community if you so choose. That's the only things involved that's needed for it. Now, a bunch of people, a bunch of anarchists, contemporary anarchists, disagree with this. They assert that that is a state, while the definition of a state is an involuntary monopoly on force. This is a voluntary association. If you can picture a homeowners association, a condo, or a hotel, for example, people could live in, let's say, a building, for example. Each room a person owns, but the overall building is held in what would be a commonship of property owners. And part of that would have rules. And since they have an interest in their property, it makes sense to have rules. In every society, there will always be rules. There will always be rules, whether they're in the form of law, which law in itself is not legislative. There is legislative fiat, which is by government. But there are natural phenomena that we can observe that is law. For example, social norm, the aversion towards rape, the aversion towards murder, the aversion towards theft. These are all common things that we can agree on that are bad. And we agree that they are bad, and as a result, we come up with rules on how to avoid these things, have a respect for private property, which an individual owns themselves. So if an individual imparts themselves on another individual without their consent, that in itself is a form of aggression against property, which a person can own themselves. And that is very apparent in Western philosophy, in natural law philosophy, for example, John Locke. So what the difference overall here is that a covenant community is voluntary while a state is involuntary. What libertarians have a problem with is the involuntary monopoly on force that then leads to a state imposing its will on other people. That is the contention libertarians have against the state. This monopoly on force is unethical. It leads to a lot of social unharmony. And in general, it's not how society ought to be run. So what Hans Hermann Hoppe is laying out here is a situation where if people like the concept of a community, but they don't like the aspects of state coercion, then he presents an alternative to the social contract, to a literal social contract where private property is respected and where like-minded individuals can exercise the idea of community without infringing on other people's rights. The ideas, and a lot of people get this wrong about Hans Hermann Hoppe, and a lot of people haven't actually read Hans Hermann Hoppe. Some people have just read the introduction, stopped reading, and formed their judgments based off of that. However, that's very disingenuous. If I were to read just the introduction of Samuel Edward Konkin III, the agorist philosopher, and make my judgment just based off the introduction, how fair is that? So what I am saying here is that many people need to actually read the works of Hans Hermann Hoppe instead of going off of what a grifter says, what a person staunchly opposed to it says. And don't take my word for it. Actually read Democracy, the God That Failed, and What Needs to Be Done. That's a great book by him. And actually read and listen to the lectures versus just listening to somebody's opinion on those things. You're listening to my opinion. However, I am putting forward the invitation to actually learn those ideals and understand those ideals, versus what some have done, where it's a combination of word salad, where people don't actually understand the ideas, but they want to make a judgment anyways. But what really boils down to here is that Hans Hermann Hoppe's ideas are voluntary. They're not a state, they're not involuntary. They are just suggestions on what ought to be done to have a stateless society, but have it sustainable, have rules, have private law, have a rights arbitration, and prevent it from breaking down into absolute chaos. Now, that wouldn't be the case, but it's a good framework for how a libertarian society could be done. It could totally be done without that, but it's a good way on how to adapt contractual law and natural law into a way that people can simply understand it. Anyways, I am the Executioner, and I hope you guys have a Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year. Videos coming out tomorrow where I save Christmas from Richard Wolff. Hope you guys like the video, subscribe, and ring